The amber glow of dusk stretched across the Montana territory like a gilded blanket, washing over the weathered buildings of Whisperwood as Ranger Quinn dismounted from his stallion. His bones ached from 3 days in the saddle, tracking a band of cattle rustlers who'd vanished into the wilderness like morning mist. The year was 1876, and the West was still wild, untamed, and unforgiving, much like the man himself. The wind carried the scent of pine and approaching rain as Ranger moved with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. At 32, his face bore the weathered lines of someone who'd seen both beauty and brutality in equal measure. His dark beard was trimmed close, and his blue eyes held the kind of steady gaze that made men think twice about lying to him. The small cabin stood apart from the town, perched on a gentle rise that offered a view of the rolling plains beyond. It wasn't his destination, but something about the solitary light in the window pulled at him. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the instinct that had kept him alive all these years, patrolling the frontier, the sense that something wasn't quite right. He tied his horse to a hitching post and approached quietly, his spurs silent with each careful step. As he drew closer, he noticed the cabin door was ajar, and the faint sound of paper rustling drifted through the opening. Ranger's hand moved instinctively to his Colt revolver as he eased the door open with his boot. What he found inside wasn't the danger he'd anticipated, but something that stopped him cold. A young woman sat at a small table, her auburn hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. A single candle illuminated her face, casting shadows across features that might have been called delicate if not for the strength evident in her jawline. Spread before her were dozens of letters, some folded neatly, others open and worn at the creases from frequent handling. She looked up, startled by his presence, and for a moment neither spoke. Her eyes, the color of whiskey in sunlight, widened with alarm. "Madam," Ranger said, removing his hat, "forgive the intrusion. I saw the light and the open door, thought there might be trouble." "There's no trouble here, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands as she gathered the letters. "Except perhaps you're trespassing." Ranger nodded, accepting the rebuke. "I'll take my leave then." But as he turned to go, a photograph slipped from among the papers and drifted to the floor near his boots. He bent to retrieve it, a young man in a Union Army uniform, his smile confident, his eyes filled with hope. The woman's breath caught as he handed it back to her. "These," she said quietly, gesturing to the scattered papers, "these are all I have left of him." Something in her words, in the quiet dignity of her grief, resonated deep within Ranger's chest. He recognized the look in her eyes. He'd seen it in his own reflection too many times. "My name is Ranger Quinn," he said, remaining in the doorway. "I'm tracking rustlers who have been plaguing these parts. I didn't mean to disturb you, miss." "Charlotte Hayes," she replied, straightening her shoulders. "Most folks call me Charlie." He nodded, noting how she protectively gathered the letters closer. "Would you like me to check around the property before I go, Miss Hayes? These are uncertain times." "The war's been over for 11 years, Mr. Quinn. The times have always been uncertain." There was a sharpness to her words, but no malice. "Some wars never quite end, madam," he replied, his voice low. "Not in the places that matter." Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I suppose you're right about that." She hesitated, then gestured to the pot hanging in the fireplace. "There's coffee, if you'd care for some. It seems a poor repayment for frightening a lady in her home, but I imagine you've ridden far." Ranger hesitated. He needed to report to the sheriff in town, but the weariness in his bones and something else, something he couldn't quite name, made him nod. "Much obliged." As Charlotte poured the coffee into a chipped mug, Ranger took in the cabin's sparse furnishings. It was clean and orderly, but there was a provisional quality to it, as if its occupant hadn't fully committed to staying. "Are you passing through Whisperwood, Miss Hayes?" he asked, accepting the steaming cup with a nod of thanks. "I've been here 3 months," she replied, carefully folding the letters and returning them to a wooden box. "I teach at the schoolhouse. The children need education even out here, perhaps especially out here." Ranger sipped the coffee, strong and bitter but welcome after days of trail rations. "Noble profession. Necessary one," she corrected. Her gaze drifted to the photograph she'd placed atop the stack of letters. "Robert would have wanted me to make myself useful." "Your husband?" Ranger asked before he could stop himself. "My brother," Charlotte answered, closing the box with a quiet finality. "He died at Shiloh." Ranger nodded, understanding blooming. The war had claimed many, and its shadow stretched long across the nation, touching even this remote corner of the Montana Territory. "I was at Antietam," he said simply. Their eyes met across the small room, and a moment of recognition passed between them, the silent acknowledgement of shared wounds. "Union?" she asked. He nodded. "Pennsylvania 83rd. Robert was with the 4th Illinois. Letters came regular until April 1862. Her fingers traced the pattern on the wooden box. "Then nothing but this official notice. Says he died a hero." A bitter smile crossed her lips. "As if that makes it easier." "It doesn't," Ranger agreed. "Nothing does." They fell into silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Some understandings needed no words. "You said you're tracking rustlers," Charlotte finally asked, changing the subject. Ranger set his empty cup down. "3 men hit the Henderson place 2 nights ago. Took 20 head of prime beef cattle. I've been on their trail since dawn yesterday." "And it led you here, to Whisperwood?" "Near enough. They're smart keeping to rocky ground, crossing streams, but no man can vanish completely. Not out here." He stood, settling his hat back on his head. "I should report to Sheriff Dawson before it gets much later." Charlotte nodded, rising as well. "Of course, thank you for checking on me, Mr. Quinn." "Ranger," he corrected. "Just Ranger." "Ranger, then." She offered a small smile. "I hope you find what you're looking for." He tipped his hat and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Those letters, they're a fine thing to have. Memories are worth keeping." "Sometimes I think they're a burden," she said softly. "But yes, they're precious too. Good night, Miss Hayes." "Good night, Ranger." As he mounted his horse and rode toward the lights of Whisperwood, Ranger couldn't shake the image of Charlotte Hayes reading her brother's letters by candlelight, preserving his memory with each careful unfolding of paper. Sheriff Dawson was waiting on the porch of his office when Ranger arrived in town. A broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard, Dawson had been keeping the peace in Whisperwood for 15 years. "About damn time, Quinn," he called, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Was beginning to think those rustlers got the better of you." Ranger dismounted, his muscles protesting after the long ride. "Lost their trail about 10 miles east, near the Johnson Creek crossing. They're heading for the mountains." Dawson frowned, stroking his beard. "Reckon they might be working with that bunch from over Hardscrabble way. The Collier gang's been getting bolder." "Possibly." Ranger led his horse to the water trough. "The tracks suggest 3 riders, maybe 4. They know what they're doing, splitting the herd, driving them through water to hide the trail." "Well, you'll pick it up again tomorrow. Get some rest. Martha's got a room ready for you at the boarding house." Dawson eyed him shrewdly. "Saw you stop at the schoolteacher's place." "Miss Hayes giving you trouble?" Ranger shook his head. "Just checking an open door. Thought there might be trouble." Dawson chuckled. "Charlie Hayes can handle herself. Feisty one, that girl. Came out here all alone from Illinois last winter. Took over the school when old Mrs. Willoughby's arthritis got too bad. Kids adore her, but she keeps to herself otherwise. Seems like a private person, Ranger agreed noncommittally. Too pretty to stay a spinster much longer, I'd wager, Dawson continued. Half the unmarried men in the county have come sniffing around, but she won't give him the time of day. Mourning her brother still, I reckon. Ranger merely nodded, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I'll be heading out at first light. Any of your deputies available to ride with me? Johnson and Peters are both down with that fever that's going around, but I can spare young Davis if you need him. I'll manage. Ranger preferred working alone anyway. Fewer distractions, fewer complications. After stabling his horse and collecting his saddlebags, Ranger made his way to Martha Ingram's boarding house. The two-story clapboard building was the closest thing Whisperwood had to a hotel, and Martha's reputation for clean beds and hearty meals was known throughout the territory. "Mr. Quinn," Martha greeted him warmly as he entered. A plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands, she had a motherly air that put even the wariest travelers at ease. "Sheriff said you might be coming. You must be exhausted. Have you eaten?" "Not since noon, madam," Ranger admitted. "Well, sit yourself down. I've got stew still warm on the stove and fresh bread." Too tired to argue, Ranger dropped his saddlebags by the stairs and took a seat at the long table in the dining room. Martha bustled away and returned moments later with a steaming bowl and thick slices of bread slathered with butter. "Eat up now," she encouraged. "You're too lean by half." The stew was rich with chunks of beef, potatoes, and carrots, and Ranger realized just how hungry he was. As he ate, Martha kept him company, filling the silence with news of Whisperwood and its inhabitants. "Did you happen to see our Miss Hayes when you rode in?" Martha asked, refilling his coffee cup. "Her cabin's just outside of town." Ranger paused mid-bite, wondering why Charlotte Hayes seemed to be a topic of such interest. "Briefly," he acknowledged. Martha nodded, looking satisfied. "Good woman, that one. Smart as a whip and kind-hearted, too. Been teaching the children to read Shakespeare, if you can believe it." Some of the parents complained at first, said their youngsters didn't need fancy literature to run a farm or work a claim. But Charlie, she's persuasive. "Sounds like you admire her," Ranger observed. "I do indeed. Takes courage to leave everything behind and start fresh out here. Especially for a woman alone." Martha's expression grew somber. "Lost her whole family, poor thing. Parents died of influenza when she was just 18, then her brother in the war. Came out west to make a new life, she told me." Ranger finished his meal in thoughtful silence. He wasn't one to pry into others' affairs, but something about Charlotte Hayes intrigued him. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity with which she carried her grief, or the determination to build something new from the ashes of loss, a struggle he understood all too well. After thanking Martha for the meal, Ranger climbed the narrow stairs to his room. It was small but comfortable, with a bed, washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. He removed his gun belt, hanging it on the bedpost within easy reach, and sat heavily on the edge of the mattress. From his pocket, he withdrew a worn photograph, a woman with laughing eyes and a boy of about 5 sitting on her lap. His wife Sarah and son James, taken just weeks before the typhoid swept through their Kansas homestead in '68. 8 years gone now, but the ache remained, a constant companion he'd learned to live with. Ranger placed the photograph on the nightstand and extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, his thoughts drifted to Charlotte Hayes and her box of letters, all she had left of her brother, treasured and preserved against the erosion of time and memory. He understood that impulse all too well. In a world that moved relentlessly forward, sometimes all you could do was hold tight to the fragments of what once was. Morning came with the sound of roosters crowing and wagon wheels on the packed dirt of Whisperwood's Main Street. Ranger rose before dawn, as was his habit, and prepared for another day of tracking. He'd need to find where he lost the trail yesterday and pick up the rustler's path again before it grew too cold. After a quick breakfast of eggs and bacon provided by the ever-efficient Martha, Ranger collected his horse from the livery and headed out of town. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains. It was the kind of morning that reminded a man why he chose this life, despite its hardships. As he passed Charlotte's cabin, he noticed her out front, splitting firewood with surprising efficiency. She wore a simple blue dress with the sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back in a practical braid. She paused, wiping her brow as he approached. "You're an early riser, Miss Hayes," he called, tipping his hat. She rested the axe against the chopping block and offered a small smile. "As are you, Mr. Quinn, back on the hunt. Rustlers won't catch themselves." He hesitated, then added, "That's man's work you're doing there." A flash of defiance crossed her features. "Is it? Strange, because I seem to be doing it just fine." Ranger felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "So you are, my apologies." Charlotte's expression softened. "No need to apologize. I'm used to doing things for myself." She gestured toward the cabin. "Would you care for coffee before you ride out? It's already brewed." The invitation surprised him. "Thank you, but I should get going while the trail's fresh." She nodded, understanding. "Of course. Good hunting, then." "Miss Hayes," he said, preparing to ride on, "might I ask why a woman with your education would choose Whisperwood? Seems there'd be more opportunities in a larger town." Charlotte considered the question, absently brushing wood chips from her skirt. "After Robert died, everything in Illinois reminded me of him, of who we were together and who I was supposed to be. I needed space, room to breathe and decide who I might become now." She looked up at him with those remarkable eyes. "I imagine you understand that, Mr. Quinn." He did. "All too well. The West has a way of letting a person reinvent themselves," he agreed, "for better or worse. Indeed it does." She picked up her axe again, signaling an end to the conversation. "Be careful out there, Ranger. Those rustlers won't take kindly to being pursued." With a final nod, Ranger urged his horse forward, but the exchange lingered in his mind as he rode. Charlotte Hayes was an unexpected presence in a frontier town like Whisperwood, educated, refined, yet practical enough to survive its hardships. And beneath her composed exterior, he sensed a kindred spirit, someone who understood loss and had chosen to keep moving forward despite it. The day stretched long as Ranger tracked the rustlers through increasingly difficult terrain. He found where they'd crossed Johnson Creek, cleverly using the water to hide their trail, but spotted broken branches on the far bank that betrayed their passage. As he suspected, they were heading for the mountains, likely planning to drive the stolen cattle through one of the high passes into the next territory. By late afternoon, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising a substantial storm. Reluctantly, Ranger decided to make camp in a sheltered ravine. Pressing on in a downpour would be foolish. Even the best tracker couldn't follow signs washed away by heavy rain. He had just finished setting up a lean-to when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, the sky opened up, sending sheets of water cascading down. Lightning split the darkening sky, followed by rumbling thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. Ranger huddled beneath his makeshift shelter, chewing on jerky and hardtack as the storm raged. His thoughts drifted back to Whisperwood, to Sheriff Dawson waiting for his report, to Martha's warm kitchen, and inevitably to Charlotte Hayes reading her brother's letters by candlelight. There was something about her that tugged at him, something beyond her obvious beauty or the shared experience of loss. Perhaps it was the quiet strength she exhibited, or the fact that, like him, she'd chosen to rebuild her life far from the memories that haunted her. The storm showed no signs of abating by nightfall. Ranger wrapped himself in his blanket and tried to sleep, but rest eluded him. Instead, his mind kept conjuring images of Charlotte, the careful way she handled those treasured letters, the defiant tilt of her chin when he'd commented on her wood chopping, the momentary softening of her expression when she spoke of needing space to breathe. It had been years since a woman had occupied his thoughts this way. After Sarah died, Ranger had thrown himself into his work, finding solace in the solitary life of a lawman on the frontier. He'd convinced himself that he preferred it that way: no attachments, no vulnerability, no risk of that devastating loss again. Yet here he was, lying awake in a storm-lashed ravine, thinking of a schoolteacher with whiskey-colored eyes and a box full of memories. The storm continued through the night and into the next day, turning the terrain into a muddy morass that made tracking impossible. By mid-afternoon, Ranger reluctantly turned back toward Whisperwood. The rustlers would have a substantial lead now, but there was no sense in a futile chase. Better to regroup, gather intelligence, and try a different approach. It was nearly dusk when the lights of Whisperwood appeared through the drizzle. The town looked forlorn in the rain, its buildings hunched against the weather, smoke from chimneys immediately dispersed by the persistent wind. Ranger reported to Sheriff Dawson, who took the news of the failed pursuit with resigned acceptance. "Those Collier boys are slippery as eels," he muttered. "Been plaguing ranchers across 3 territories. We'll get 'em eventually." "I'll head out again when the weather clears," Ranger promised. "Maybe try approaching from the north next time, cut them off before they reach the high country." Dawson nodded, offering Ranger a shot of whiskey. "Good plan. In the meantime, rest up. You look half drowned." After stabling his horse, Ranger headed toward Martha's boarding house, looking forward to dry clothes and a hot meal. As he passed the schoolhouse, he noticed a light still burning inside despite the late hour. Curiosity getting the better of him, Ranger climbed the steps and peered through the window. Charlotte sat at her desk, surrounded by papers, a lantern casting its warm glow over her work. She appeared to be grading assignments, her expression alternating between concentration and amusement as she read her students' efforts. Without fully considering his actions, Ranger knocked on the door. Charlotte looked up, startled, then came to open it. "Mr. Quinn," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "You're back and soaked to the skin." "Storm washed out the trail," he explained, suddenly feeling foolish for disturbing her. "Saw your light, thought I'd check that everything was all right." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Are you making a habit of this, Ranger? Checking on me?" "Occupational hazard," he replied, returning her smile. "Keeping an eye on things." Charlotte considered him for a moment, then stepped back from the doorway. "You'd better come in before you catch your death. I have a pot of tea brewing." The schoolhouse was a single large room with rows of benches and desks facing a blackboard. Charlotte's desk stood on a small platform at the front, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner provided welcome heat against the chill of the rainy evening. "Sit by the stove," she instructed, moving to a small side table where a teapot sat. "You're dripping on my clean floor." "Sorry about that," Ranger said, removing his hat and running a hand through his damp hair. Charlotte poured 2 cups of tea and brought one to him. "So the rustlers escaped, for now." He accepted the cup gratefully, letting its warmth seep into his cold hands. "Weather gave them the advantage, but we'll catch up to them. Always do eventually." "You sound very certain of that," Ranger shrugged. "Has to be that way in my line of work. Doubt gets men killed." Charlotte returned to her desk, gathering the papers into a neat stack. The children have been writing compositions about what they want to be when they grow up. Half the boys want to be lawmen like you and Sheriff Dawson. Chasing outlaws seems glamorous to them. And what do you tell them? That there are many ways to build a just world. That courage comes in different forms. She glanced up at him. That sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply to carry on day after day, building something worthwhile. Ranger nodded slowly. Wise words, not original ones. My brother wrote something similar in one of his letters from the front. She absently touched a locket that hung at her throat. He had a gift for finding hope in dark places. Sounds like a remarkable man. He was. Her voice softened with memory. Funny and kind and so very brave. Not just in battle but in life. He faced everything head-on with such certainty that things would work out. Even when our parents died, he never lost that optimism. And you? Ranger asked quietly. Did you share his outlook? Charlotte's smile turned wistful. I was always the cautious one. The planner. Robert used to tease me about it, said I needed to trust that the universe would provide. She shook her head slightly. After he died, I realized I'd been right all along. The universe doesn't provide. It takes. The raw honesty of her words resonated deeply with Ranger. Yes, he agreed. It does. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the rain drumming steadily on the schoolhouse roof. I should let you get back to your work, Ranger said finally, rising to his feet. Thank you for the tea. Charlotte walked with him to the door. Thank you for checking on me. Again. As he stepped back into the rain, Charlotte called after him. Ranger, Robert would have liked you. He turned, touched by the unexpected comment. Why do you say that? He admired straightforward men. Those who say what they mean and do what they say. She hesitated, then added, if you'd like to hear more about him sometime. I have his letters. The invitation hung between them, fragile and significant. I'd like that, Ranger said simply. With a final nod, he turned and headed into the rain-soaked evening. Aware that something had shifted between them, a door opening onto possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider in a very long time. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean. Ranger rose early and walked to the sheriff's office, where he found Dawson already at his desk, reviewing wanted posters. Got a telegram from Sheriff Bryce over in Helena, Dawson announced without preamble. Collier gang was spotted near there 2 days ago. Seems they've moved north. Ranger frowned. That doesn't match the trail I was following. You think there might be 2 separate groups working these parts? Could be. Or maybe they split up to confuse us. Dawson stroked his beard thoughtfully. Either way, I think you should head up to Helena, compare notes with Bryce. Might be we can coordinate, catch these bastards in a pincer move. Makes sense, Ranger agreed. I can leave this afternoon. Good. It's about a 3-day ride if the weather holds. Dawson hesitated, then added with feigned casualness, saw you at the schoolhouse last night. Ranger met the sheriff's gaze steadily. Just checking in. Professional courtesy. Uh-huh. Dawson's eyes twinkled with knowing amusement. Well, while you're professionally checking in, you might want to know that Charlie teaches until noon on Saturdays. Afternoons, she usually tends her garden or visits that meadow east of town. Likes to sketch the wildflowers, I hear. Ranger raised an eyebrow. Is that information relevant to my duties, Sheriff? Dawson chuckled. Just filling you in on the local routines, deputy. All part of effective law enforcement. With a non-committal grunt, Ranger left to prepare for his journey to Helena. But as he gathered supplies and checked his gear, he found himself calculating that he had several hours before he needed to depart, plenty of time to visit a certain meadow east of town. Around midday, Ranger saddled his horse and rode in the direction Dawson had indicated. The storm had left the landscape vibrantly green, with wildflowers dotting the rolling hills in splashes of color. After about 20 minutes, he spotted a solitary figure sitting on a flat rock overlooking a meadow bursting with blue lupines and golden balsamroot. Charlotte wore a simple dress of pale yellow, her hair loose around her shoulders, a sketch pad on her lap. She looked up as he approached, shading her eyes against the sun. "Mr. Quinn," she called. "Twice in 2 days, people will talk." "Let them," he replied, dismounting and tethering his horse to a nearby sapling. "It's a beautiful day." "It is indeed." She made room for him on the large, flat boulder. "I come here when I need perspective. The vastness of the landscape has a way of putting human concerns in their proper size." Ranger settled beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Your brother's letters," he began. "You offered to share them." Charlotte looked momentarily surprised, then pleased. "I did, though I didn't expect you'd take me up on it so soon. I'm riding to Helena this afternoon. Sheriff thinks the rustlers might have headed north." He paused, suddenly uncertain. "But I wanted to see you before I left." A flush of color touched her cheeks. "Well, I'm glad you did." She reached into the basket beside her and withdrew a familiar wooden box. "I bring them with me sometimes." "Silly, perhaps, but it feels like including him in my new life." "Not silly at all," Ranger assured her. Charlotte opened the box and selected a letter. "This one's from his first week at training camp. He was so excited to be part of something important." She unfolded the paper carefully and began to read. "Dear Charlie, you should see this place. Men everywhere, from every walk of life, all united in purpose. Yesterday a lawyer from Chicago helped a farmer's son from downstate learn to properly lace his boots. There's a spirit here that makes me believe we really can preserve this union. The food is terrible, though. A man could break a tooth on the biscuits they serve. I've taken to dunking mine in coffee until they're soft enough to eat without risking dental disaster." Charlotte's voice brought the words to life, and Ranger could almost see the young soldier, full of patriotic fervor and good humor. As she continued reading, moving on to other letters that chronicled Robert's experiences, Ranger found himself drawn into the narrative of this man he'd never met, but was coming to know through his sister's voice and his own written words. Some letters were amusing, filled with anecdotes about camp life and Robert's fellow soldiers. Others were more thoughtful, reflecting on the meaning of the conflict and his hopes for a reunited nation. The final few, written just before Shiloh, carried an undercurrent of foreboding beneath the customary optimism. "I cannot say when this madness will end," Charlotte read from the last letter, her voice growing softer, "but I know with certainty that what we do here matters. If I don't return, please don't grieve too bitterly. Live boldly, Charlie. Find joy where you can. That's what I'm fighting for, not just the Union, but for a world where people can pursue happiness freely. Promise me you'll do that." She folded the letter carefully, her fingers lingering on the creases. The official notice of his death arrived 2 weeks later. He was leading a charge against a Confederate position. They said he saved many of his men through his quick thinking and bravery. "He sounds like an extraordinary man," Ranger said quietly. "He was." Charlotte returned the letters to their box. "Sometimes I wonder what he would think of my life now, teaching in a frontier town so far from everything we knew." "I think he'd be proud," Ranger offered. "You're building something worthwhile here, helping shape the future of this territory through those children." Charlotte looked at him with surprise. "That's a generous way to see it. It's the truth." Ranger hesitated, then added, "I had a family once, wife and son, lost them to typhoid in '68. Charlotte's expression softened with understanding. "I'm so sorry, Ranger. For a long time after, I just existed, moved from town to town, took whatever jobs kept me busy enough not to think. He looked out over the wildflower-strewn meadow. It's taken years to feel like I'm living again, not just surviving. And are you? Living, I mean. The question hung between them, weighted with significance. Getting there, he answered honestly. Some days are better than others. Charlotte nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey through grief. I think that's all any of us can ask for, progress, not perfection. They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching clouds drift across the vast Montana sky. Finally, Ranger stood reluctantly. I should head out if I want to make decent progress before nightfall. Charlotte rose as well, gathering her sketch pad and box of letters. How long will you be gone? Week, maybe more. Depends on what Sheriff Bryce and I decide about these rustlers. Well, she said, offering a small smile, Whisperwood will be here when you return, as will I. The simple statement carried a promise that warmed Ranger unexpectedly. I'll hold you to that, Miss Hayes. Charlotte, she corrected. Or Charlie, if you prefer. I think we've moved beyond formalities, don't you, Charlie? He repeated, liking the way it felt. Safe travels, Ranger. I hope you catch your rustlers. As he mounted his horse, Ranger found himself reluctant to leave. Those letters, he said impulsively. Thank you for sharing them. For sharing your brother with me. Charlotte's smile deepened, touching her eyes. Thank you for listening. It's been a long time since I've read them aloud to someone who understood. With a final nod, Ranger turned his horse toward Helena, aware that he was leaving something important behind in Whisperwood, something he'd be eager to return to when his business was concluded. The journey to Helena took 3 days of hard riding through rugged country. Sheriff Bryce, a weathered veteran of the frontier with a reputation for honesty and competence, greeted Ranger with wary respect. Quinn, he said, shaking Ranger's hand firmly. Heard about your work down in Wyoming Territory. Good to have you on this. Together, they mapped out what they knew of the Collier gang's movements, identifying patterns and predicting possible hideouts in the mountainous region between their jurisdictions. It became clear that the rustlers were operating with a sophistication that suggested inside information. Someone's tipping them off about valuable herds and patrol schedules, Bryce concluded grimly. Could be anyone, ranch hands, traders, even someone connected to law enforcement. The revelation complicated their task. They needed to be circumspect, revealing their plans to as few people as possible. After much discussion, they devised a strategy. Ranger would return to Whisperwood, but quietly circle back to rendezvous with Bryce and a small contingent of trusted deputies at a predetermined location. From there, they would approach the suspected hideout from multiple directions, cutting off escape routes. Give me 10 days to get my men in position, Bryce said as they finalized their plan. We'll move on the 15th, Ranger nodded, already mentally preparing for the operation. It would be dangerous. The Collier gang was known for its ruthlessness. But the chance to put an end to their depredations was worth the risk. As he rode back toward Whisperwood, Ranger found his thoughts continually returning to Charlotte. Their conversations in the meadow had affected him more deeply than he'd expected. The sharing of her brother's letters had created an intimacy between them, a foundation of understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. For years, Ranger had deliberately avoided forming attachments, convinced that the solitary life was safer. Relationships meant vulnerability, and vulnerability led to pain. But Charlotte's presence in his thoughts was persistent, like a melody he couldn't stop humming. It was nearly sunset on the 6th day when Whisperwood came into view. Despite the weariness of the journey, Ranger felt a quickening of anticipation as he approached the town. He reported briefly to Sheriff Dawson, sharing only the official version of his discussion with Bryce that they were coordinating efforts, but still gathering intelligence on the rustler's whereabouts. "Good work," Dawson said. "Take a couple days to rest up before heading out again." Ranger nodded, relieved that the plan allowed him some time in Whisperwood before he would need to slip away to the rendezvous point. After seeing to his horse, Ranger walked to Martha's boarding house, where the motherly proprietress greeted him with her usual warmth. "You're just in time for supper," she declared, ushering him inside. "And you've got company tonight. Miss Hayes is joining us. She helps me with the mending sometimes in exchange for a proper meal. Says she gets tired of her own cooking." Sure enough, Charlotte sat at the long dining table, needle flashing through fabric as she hemmed a tablecloth. She looked up as Ranger entered, her face brightening. "You're back," she said simply. "As promised," he replied. Martha looked between them with poorly concealed interest. "Well, I'll just check on that stew. Charlie, why don't you set that aside and help our weary traveler to some refreshment?" As Martha bustled off to the kitchen, Charlotte set down her sewing and rose. "Successful journey?" she asked, pouring Ranger a cup of coffee from the pot on the sideboard. "Informative," he answered carefully, accepting the cup. "Good to be back, though." Their eyes met over the rim of his coffee cup, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of the connection that had begun to form before his departure. Dinner was a lively affair, with several other boarders joining them at the table. Martha served a hearty beef stew with dumplings, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Throughout the meal, Ranger found his attention continually drawn to Charlotte, who participated in the general conversation with wit and warmth. After dinner, as the other boarders dispersed to their evening activities, Charlotte lingered, helping Martha clear the table. "I should be getting home," she said finally, collecting her shawl. "It's getting late." "I'll walk you," Ranger offered immediately. "It's dark out." Martha beamed approvingly. "What a gentleman. Charlie, you take him up on that offer." A lady shouldn't be walking alone after sunset, even in a town as peaceful as ours. Outside, the night was cool and clear, stars blanketing the sky above them. They walked in comfortable silence for a time, their footsteps crunching on the packed dirt of Whisperwood's Main Street. "I missed our conversations," Charlotte said finally. "Peculiar, isn't it? We've known each other such a short time." "Not so peculiar," Ranger replied. "Some connections don't require years to form." She glanced at him sideways, her face half illuminated by the moonlight. "Is that what we have, Ranger? A connection?" The directness of her question caught him off guard, but he appreciated her straightforwardness. "Yes," he said simply. "I believe we do." They had reached her cabin now, the small structure silhouetted against the starlit sky. Charlotte paused at the steps, turning to face him. "Would you like to come in for a while? I could make tea." Ranger hesitated, aware of the implications of entering a single woman's home at night. "Are you sure? People talk in small towns." Charlotte's smile was both defiant and amused. "Let them. I've never much cared for others dictating my choices." Her expression softened. "Besides, I think we both know you're not the type of man to compromise a lady's reputation." "No," he agreed. "I'm not." Inside, the cabin was just as he remembered, neat and sparsely furnished, but with touches that made it distinctly Charlotte's. Books lined a small shelf, and a vase of wildflowers brightened the table. The wooden box containing Robert's letters sat on the mantelpiece, a silent guardian of memory. As Charlotte prepared the tea, Ranger noticed a half-finished sketch on her small desk, a rendering of the meadow where they had sat together, with remarkable attention to detail in the wildflowers and grasses. "You're talented," he observed, examining the drawing. "It passes the time," she replied, bringing 2 cups to the table. I find it soothing, a way to preserve moments that matter. They sat across from each other, the candle between them casting a warm glow over their faces. For a time, they spoke of inconsequential things: the progress of Charlotte's students, the changing season, Martha's matchmaking tendencies. But beneath the casual conversation ran a current of deeper understanding. "How long will you stay in Whisperwood?" Charlotte asked eventually. Ranger considered his answer carefully. He couldn't reveal the planned operation against the Collier gang, but he didn't want to lie to her either. "I'm not certain," he said finally. "There's still work to be done with these rustlers after that." He shrugged. "I go where I'm needed." "A transient life," Charlotte observed. "Do you ever tire of it? The constant movement?" It was a question Ranger had asked himself with increasing frequency lately. "Sometimes," he admitted. "There are moments when I wonder what it might be like to stay somewhere, put down roots." "And what do you conclude?" Ranger met her gaze steadily. "That it would depend on what or who was there to root me." The implication hung in the air between them, neither willing to look away first. Finally, Charlotte broke the silence. "I came to Whisperwood seeking anonymity, a fresh start. I thought that meant isolation, keeping my heart safely locked away with my memories." She traced the rim of her cup with one finger. "But lately, I've wondered if that's truly what Robert would have wanted for me." "What do you think he would say?" Ranger asked softly. Charlotte smiled, a mixture of sadness and fondness in her expression. "He'd tell me to stop hiding, to live boldly, as he wrote in that last letter." She looked up at Ranger. "He'd like that I've met someone who understands loss without being defined by it." The honesty of her words touched something deep within Ranger. Before he could respond, Charlotte rose and moved to the mantelpiece, retrieving the wooden box. "There's one letter I didn't share with you," she said, returning to the table. "The first one he wrote after our parents died. I was 18, he was 22. We were both so lost." She opened the box and carefully extracted a letter that looked more worn than the others, its creases soft from frequent handling. As she unfolded it, Ranger noticed her hands trembling slightly. "Dearest Charlie," she began reading, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "I know you're angry with me for enlisting. You feel I'm abandoning you when we should be facing our grief together. Perhaps you're right. But in the wake of such devastating loss, I find I need purpose more than ever, something to fight for, to believe in." Charlotte paused, drawing a deep breath before continuing. "We cannot bring them back, sister mine, but we can honor them by living lives of meaning. Find your purpose, Charlie. It may not be what you expected, and it may lead you far from the path you thought you'd walk. But trust that even in the darkest night, new stars can appear to guide you." She folded the letter carefully, her eyes meeting Ranger's across the table. "When I decided to come west, this letter was my talisman, my permission to seek a different life than the one I'd planned." "And have you found it, your purpose?" Ranger asked. "I've found parts of it," she answered thoughtfully. "Teaching brings me joy. Helping shape young minds feels meaningful. But there are still pieces missing." Her gaze held his. "What about you, Ranger? Have you found your purpose in pursuing justice?" It was a profound question, one that required honest reflection. "For a time the work was enough," he said slowly. "It gave structure to days that might otherwise have been empty. But lately—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Lately I've found myself wanting more than just purpose, wanting connection." The candle between them flickered, sending shadows dancing across their faces. In the soft light, Charlotte looked both vulnerable and determined, a woman on the threshold of a decision. "It's getting late," Ranger said reluctantly. "I should go." Charlotte nodded, but as they both stood, she impulsively reached for his hand. "Ranger," she said softly, "I'm glad you came back." Her hand in his felt right, like a piece clicking into place. So am I, Charlie. Outside, the night had deepened, stars burning bright in the vast Montana sky. At the doorway they paused, the moment waited with possibility. "Good night, Charlotte Hayes," Ranger said, gently releasing her hand. "Good night, Ranger Quinn," she replied, her smile visible in the moonlight. "Until tomorrow." As he walked back toward town, Ranger felt a lightness that had been absent for years. Something was beginning between them, something that both exhilarated and terrified him. After so long holding himself apart, the prospect of opening his heart again was daunting. Yet the alternative, walking away from this connection with Charlotte, seemed unthinkable. For the next few days, Ranger found reasons to see Charlotte daily. They walked together in the evenings after she finished teaching. He helped her split more firewood and repair a loose shutter on her cabin. She invited him to listen to her students recite poetry they had memorized, beaming with pride as the children performed with varying degrees of confidence. On Sunday, they attended church together, raising eyebrows among the townsfolk, but receiving warm smiles from Martha and Sheriff Dawson. Afterward, they shared a picnic by the creek, talking for hours about books they'd read, places they'd seen, and dreams they'd once had. It was during these conversations that Ranger learned more about Charlotte's life before Whisperwood. She had been raised in a comfortable home in Springfield, Illinois, the daughter of a doctor and his scholarly wife. Education had been prized in their household, with both Charlotte and Robert encouraged to pursue knowledge widely. "Our mother taught us both to read by age 4, Charlotte recalled fondly. She believed literacy was the foundation of a meaningful life. Our father wanted Robert to follow him into medicine, but Robert was more interested in law and politics. They argued about it good-naturedly." "And what did they want for you?" Ranger asked. Charlotte smiled wryly. "To make a suitable marriage primarily, but they also supported my interest in teaching. My mother had been a governess before her marriage, and she respected the profession." Her expression grew distant. "When they died, all those carefully laid plans scattered like leaves in the wind. Robert and I had to reimagine our futures entirely." In turn, Ranger shared pieces of his own history, his childhood on a small Pennsylvania farm, his service in the Union Army, his brief, happy marriage to Sarah, and the joy of fatherhood with young James. He spoke of their Kansas homestead and the devastating illness that had claimed them both in a matter of days. "After the funeral, I couldn't bear to stay," he confessed. "Everything reminded me of what I'd lost, so I sold the farm and drifted west. Took work as a scout for the Army for a while, then as a deputy in Wyoming Territory. Moved whenever the memories caught up to me." "And now," Charlotte asked softly, "are you still running?" The question cut to the heart of his circumstance. "I'm not sure," he answered honestly. "Coming to Whisperwood was just another assignment. I didn't expect to find reasons to stay." Their eyes met in shared understanding. Neither needed to articulate the growing attachment between them. It was evident in every shared glance, every lingering touch of hands, every moment of comfortable silence. But even as their connection deepened, Ranger was acutely aware of the looming operation against the Collier gang. In just 3 days, he would need to slip away to meet Sheriff Bryce at the rendezvous point. The thought of leaving without explanation troubled him, but he was bound by the need for secrecy. Any leak could endanger the mission and the men involved. On the evening before his planned departure, Ranger walked Charlotte home from the schoolhouse, as had become their custom. The sunset painted the sky in spectacular shades of orange and purple, a fitting backdrop to the difficult conversation ahead. "Charlie," he began as they approached her cabin, "there's something I need to tell you." She looked up at him, her expression open and trusting. "That sounds ominous." "It's not, At least I hope it won't be. He took a deep breath. I have to leave town for a while. Official business that I can't discuss. The rustlers, she guessed. He nodded. I can't say more than that, but I wanted you to know I'm going, even if I can't tell you where or for how long. Charlotte studied his face, understanding dawning in her eyes. It's dangerous, isn't it? It could be, he admitted, but it's my job, she nodded slowly. I appreciate your telling me, even if you can't share the details. She hesitated, then added, will you be careful, Ranger, for my sake? The simple request and the sentiment behind it touched him deeply. I will, he promised. And Charlie, when I come back. He paused, gathering courage. When I come back, there are things I'd like to say to you, important things. Charlotte's eyes softened. I'll be here, waiting to hear them. They had reached her door now. In the fading light, Charlotte looked up at him, her expression a mixture of concern and something deeper, more profound. Ranger, she said softly, I've spent years keeping memories alive. Letters and photographs and sketches preserving what was because I was afraid to embrace what could be. She reached up, her hand resting lightly against his cheek. I don't want to live that way anymore. The touch of her hand, the warmth in her eyes, it was an invitation Ranger couldn't resist. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, the meeting of two people who had known loss and were cautious about risking their hearts again. But as Charlotte's arms wound around his neck, the kiss deepened, becoming a promise, an affirmation of the connection that had grown between them. When they finally parted, Ranger rested his forehead against hers, overwhelmed by the emotions coursing through him. I'll come back to you, he whispered. That's a promise. See that you do, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears shimmering in her eyes. I've found my star in the darkness, Ranger Quinn. I'm not ready to lose its light. With a final, lingering kiss, they said their goodbyes. As Ranger walked back toward town, his heart was both heavier and lighter than it had been in years, heavy with the weight of what was at stake, yet buoyed by the knowledge that someone would be waiting for his return. Before dawn the next morning, Ranger slipped out of Whisperwood, leaving only a cryptic note for Sheriff Dawson about following a lead. The rendezvous point was a day's ride away, in a secluded valley known to few. There he found Sheriff Bryce and 5 deputies already encamped preparing for the operation. Quinn, Bryce greeted him. Right on time. We've got some new intelligence. Over a map spread on a flat rock, Bryce outlined what they'd learned. One of his informants had confirmed that the Collier gang was indeed holed up in an abandoned mining camp in the high country, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through treacherous terrain. They've got at least a dozen men, Bryce reported grimly. Well armed and expecting trouble. But they don't know we've pinpointed their location. The plan was straightforward but dangerous. They would approach from multiple directions, using the element of surprise to their advantage. Ranger, with his experience in mountain terrain, would lead one group up the less obvious eastern approach, while Bryce and his men would create a diversion from the main trail. If all goes well, we'll have them surrounded before they know what's happening, Bryce concluded. We move at dawn. That night, as they prepared weapons and checked equipment, Ranger found his thoughts continually returning to Charlotte. The memory of their kiss, of the promise in her eyes, strengthened his resolve to return safely. For the first time in years, he had someone to come back to. The attack began as planned at first light. Ranger and 2 deputies worked their way up the steep eastern slope, using the pine forest as cover. From below, they heard the commotion as Bryce's group engaged the outlaws' sentries, drawing attention to the main approach. The strategy worked initially. Ranger's group reached the outskirts of the mining camp undetected, positioning themselves to cut off any escape. But as they moved in, one of the deputies dislodged a loose rock, sending it clattering down the slope. The warning was enough. A shout went up, and suddenly bullets were flying. Ranger dove for cover behind an abandoned ore cart, returning fire as the Collier gang members scrambled to defend their position. What followed was a chaotic firefight that seemed to stretch for hours but likely lasted less than 30 minutes. Ranger moved from cover to cover, picking his shots carefully, aware of the deputies depending on him. From the other side of the camp, he could hear Bryce's men pressing their advantage, forcing the outlaws to divide their attention. Then Ranger spotted him Ellis Collier himself, the leader of the gang, attempting to flee on horseback up a hidden trail. Without hesitation, Ranger pursued, scrambling up the rocky slope. "Collier," he shouted. "It's over." The outlaw wheeled his horse, drawing a rifle from its scabbard. Ranger dove as Collier fired, feeling the bullet whiz past his ear. Rolling to his feet, he aimed and squeezed the trigger of his Colt. Collier jerked, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air. For a moment he swayed in the saddle, a look of disbelief on his face. Then he toppled to the ground. By the time Ranger reached him, Collier was gasping for breath, blood spreading across his chest. "Didn't think you'd find us," he managed. "You underestimated us," Ranger replied, kneeling beside the dying man. "It's what all your kind do eventually." Collier's laugh turned into a cough. "My kind? We're not so different, lawmen, just chose different sides of the line." His eyes were growing dim. "Tell Dawson, he trained you well." The words sent a chill through Ranger. "What are you talking about?" But Collier never answered. With a final, rattling breath, he was gone. By the time Ranger rejoined the others, the firefight was over. 3 of the Collier gang were dead, including Ellis, and the rest had surrendered. One of Bryce's deputies had taken a bullet to the shoulder but would recover. It was, by any measure, a successful operation. Yet Collier's final words nagged at Ranger. As they secured the prisoners and gathered evidence from the camp, he pulled Sheriff Bryce aside. "Collier mentioned Dawson before he died. Said Dawson trained me well." "What would he know about my relationship with Dawson?" Bryce's expression grew troubled. "That's odd, unless—" He shook his head. "I hate to consider it, but could Dawson be the leak, the one feeding them information?" The possibility was disturbing but couldn't be dismissed. "I need to get back to Whisperwood," Ranger decided. "Quietly, see what I can find out." "Be careful," Bryce warned. "If Dawson is involved, he's dangerous." With a sense of urgency driving him, Ranger rode hard for Whisperwood, taking a circuitous route to avoid being seen. His concern wasn't just for exposing potential corruption if Dawson was indeed working with the rustlers. Charlotte could be in danger simply by association with Ranger. It was nightfall when he reached the outskirts of town. Rather than entering openly, he tethered his horse in a secluded spot and continued on foot, keeping to the shadows. His first stop was Charlotte's cabin, where he was relieved to see a light burning in the window. He approached cautiously, tapping lightly on the door. When Charlotte opened it, her face illuminated with surprised joy, he quickly pressed a finger to his lips, indicating the need for quiet. "Ranger," she whispered, ushering him inside. "What's wrong? You look—" "I can't explain everything now," he interrupted gently. "But I need you to trust me. There may be danger in Whisperwood." Charlotte's expression shifted from confusion to resolve. "What can I do?" Her immediate support, without question or hesitation, strengthened his determination. Quickly, he outlined what he knew and what he suspected about Dawson's possible connection to the Collier gang. "I need to search his office," Ranger concluded. "See if there's evidence." "Not alone," Charlotte insisted. "I can help." I have a legitimate reason to be at the sheriff's office. I've been asking him to speak to my students about law enforcement. I could distract him while you look." Ranger shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. If he suspects anything, he won't," Charlotte interrupted. "He sees me as a harmless schoolteacher, and I'm a better actress than you might think." Her eyes held his, unwavering. "Let me help you, Ranger. We're in this together now." Looking at her determined expression, Ranger realized she was right. They were in this together had been since that first night he'd found her reading letters by candlelight, and he needed help if he was going to expose the truth without alerting Dawson. "All right," he agreed reluctantly, "but we do this carefully. Tomorrow morning you go see Dawson about this school visit. Get him talking, keep him distracted. I'll slip in through the back window and look for evidence." Charlotte nodded, her expression serious. "And if you find something, I'll signal you 3 taps on the wall. Make your excuses and leave immediately. Meet me back here." He took her hands in his. "Charlie, if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you get out of there. Promise me." "I promise," she said solemnly. Ranger stayed the night, neither of them willing to be separated after the days apart. They talked in low voices about the operation against the Collier gang, carefully avoiding the topic of what might happen if Dawson proved to be corrupt. As dawn approached, Ranger held Charlotte close, drawing strength from her presence. "Be careful today," he murmured against her hair. "You too," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. The plan proceeded as they'd discussed. Mid-morning, Charlotte made her way to the sheriff's office, dressed neatly in a blue dress that Ranger thought brought out the golden flecks in her eyes. From his vantage point behind the livery stable, he watched her enter, waited 10 minutes to ensure Dawson was engaged, then circled around to the rear of the building. The window to the small room Dawson used for records was unlatched, as Ranger had hoped. He slipped inside silently, grateful for the skills honed during years of tracking. From the front office, he could hear Charlotte's voice, animated as she described her students' interest in law enforcement. Quickly, Ranger began searching through Dawson's papers, looking for anything that might connect him to the Collier gang. At first, he found nothing suspicious, just routine reports, wanted posters, and correspondence with other lawmen. Then, in a locked drawer that yielded easily to his knife, he discovered a small ledger. Opening it, he found what he was looking for: dates, locations, and amounts, a record of payments. Besides several entries was the notation Eck Ellis Collier. But before Ranger could examine the ledger more closely, he heard the front door of the office open and a familiar voice call out. "Sheriff, got a telegram from—" The voice stopped abruptly. "Miss Hayes, what are you doing here?" It was Deputy Johnson, who Dawson had claimed was ill when Ranger was preparing to track the rustlers. The deputy sounded surprised and suspicious to find Charlotte there. "Deputy," Charlotte replied smoothly. "How nice to see you recovered from your illness." "I was just discussing a visit to the school with Sheriff Dawson." "That right," Johnson's voice had hardened, "because Sheriff's been acting mighty peculiar lately, especially where you're concerned, Miss Hayes, or should I say, where you and Quinn are concerned." Ranger tensed, sensing the situation deteriorating rapidly. He tucked the ledger into his vest and moved silently toward the doorway separating the back room from the main office. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Deputy," Charlotte said, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of tension that Ranger could detect. "But my relationship with Deputy Quinn is hardly relevant to a school visit." "Maybe not," Johnson replied. "But it might be relevant to why Quinn disappeared right when we got word the Collier gang was being targeted, and why you're here distracting the sheriff while someone's been nosing around town asking questions." There was a long pause, then Dawson's voice, cold and flat. "Quinn's back, isn't he?" and you're helping him." "I don't know what you're talking about," Charlotte replied, but Ranger could hear the fear she was trying to mask. "Search her," Dawson ordered. That was enough. Ranger burst through the doorway, gun drawn. "Back away from her," he commanded. The scene froze. Charlotte standing rigid by Dawson's desk, the sheriff half risen from his chair, Deputy Johnson's hand hovering near his holster. "Quinn," Dawson said, his face betraying no surprise. "Thought you might show up eventually. Find what you were looking for." Ranger kept his gun trained on Dawson, positioning himself between Charlotte and the two lawmen. "Found enough. The ledger in your drawer tells an interesting story, Sheriff. How long have you been taking payoffs from Ellis Collier?" Johnson's head snapped toward Dawson, genuine shock in his expression. "Sheriff, what's he talking about?" "Don't look so surprised, Johnson," Dawson replied with a cold smile. "Where do you think that extra money for the new jail came from? Or the funds for those fancy new rifles?" "You're saying town funds come from bribes?" Johnson looked ill. "From rustlers and thieves?" "I'm saying I do what's necessary to keep this town running," Dawson snapped. "The territory doesn't give us enough to maintain law and order properly. Collier was willing to pay for certain considerations. Like information on herds worth stealing," Ranger interjected, "and warnings about lawmen on their trail." Dawson shrugged, a gesture of remarkable unconcern given the circumstances. "Business arrangement, that's all. No one got hurt who didn't deserve it." "Tell that to the ranchers who lost their livelihood," Ranger countered. "Or the drovers who were shot defending their herds." "Collateral damage," Dawson said dismissively. His cold gaze shifted to Charlotte. "Like your pretty schoolteacher here might be if you don't put that gun down." Dawson's hand moved to his holster, but before he could draw, Johnson made his choice. The deputy's gun appeared as if by magic, pointed at his own sheriff. "Don't," Johnson warned. "It's over, Dawson." For a tense moment, Dawson seemed to consider his options. Then, slowly, he raised his hands in surrender. "You're making a mistake, Johnson. Town needs me." "Town needs honest law," Johnson replied firmly. "Quinn, you want to disarm him while I keep him covered." With efficient movements, Ranger removed Dawson's gun and secured his hands behind his back. Throughout the confrontation, Charlotte had remained remarkably composed, though Ranger could see the slight tremor in her hands. "You all right?" he asked her softly as Johnson began reading charges against the disgraced sheriff. She nodded, her eyes steady on his. "I am now." Word of Sheriff Dawson's arrest spread quickly through Whisperwood. Deputy Johnson, with Ranger's backing, assumed temporary authority until territorial officials could be notified. The evidence in the ledger, combined with testimony from captured members of the Collier gang who were eager to reduce their sentences, painted a damning picture of corruption that had persisted for years. In the days that followed, Ranger found himself at a crossroads. His assignment was complete: the rustlers caught, the corrupt sheriff exposed. By rights, he should be moving on to his next posting. Yet the thought of leaving Whisperwood, of leaving Charlotte, was increasingly unthinkable. A week after Dawson's arrest, Ranger and Charlotte sat together on the porch of her cabin, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. Her hand rested comfortably in his, a simple touch that conveyed more than words could express. "Johnson's been offered the sheriff's position permanently," Ranger said, breaking the companionable silence. "He's a good man. Town will be in capable hands." Charlotte nodded, her gaze still on the horizon. "And what about you? Have you received new orders?" It was the question that had hovered between them, unasked until now. Ranger turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I've been offered a position too," he said. "Right here in Whisperwood. Johnson needs a deputy he can trust." Hope blossomed in Charlotte's eyes. "And will you accept?" "That depends," Ranger replied, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since he was a much younger man, "on whether there's enough here to keep me." "Is there," she asked softly, "enough?" Ranger reached up to touch her cheek, marveling at how this woman had worked her way into his heart in such a short time. "More than enough," he assured her. "If you'll have me, Charlie, I'd like to stay, build something here. With you." Her answer was in the way she leaned into his touch, in the tears that shimmered in her eyes, in the smile that illuminated her face like the rising sun. "I'd like that very much, Ranger Quinn." As he drew her into his arms, Ranger felt a sense of homecoming unlike anything he'd experienced in years. In this woman, in this town, he had found not just purpose, but belonging, a place to put down roots and grow toward the future rather than running from the past. Later that evening, as they sat together at her small table, Charlotte brought out the wooden box of letters. Opening it, she withdrew not her brother's correspondence but a sheet of blank paper. "I've been thinking," she said, pushing the paper toward him. "Robert's letters helped me through the darkest time of my life. They connected me to someone I loved when we were separated by distance and eventually by death." Her eyes met his, filled with quiet determination. "But it's time I stopped living in letters and memories. Time to write new stories instead." Ranger understood the symbolism of the blank page before them, a future to be written together day by day. "What shall we write first?" he asked. Charlotte smiled, the candlelight catching the gold in her eyes. "How about once upon a time a cowboy found her reading letters by candlelight. And she said, 'These are all I have left of him,'" Ranger continued, "but she was wrong." "Was she?" Charlotte asked softly. "Yes," Ranger affirmed, reaching across to take her hand. "Because she had her own story still to live. And so did he." As their fingers intertwined across the blank page, Ranger knew with certainty that this was just the beginning, that the best chapters of their story were yet to be written together. Over the following weeks, Ranger settled into his new role as Whisperwood's deputy sheriff. The transition was surprisingly smooth, the townsfolk accepting him readily as one of their own. Perhaps it was his role in exposing Dawson's corruption, or perhaps it was his visible devotion to their beloved schoolteacher, but Ranger found himself welcomed into the community with open arms. Charlotte continued teaching, but now her evenings were spent with Ranger, building a life together one day at a time. They took turns cooking dinner in her small cabin, shared books and stories by the fire, and walked under the stars when the weather permitted. Their courtship was unhurried but purposeful, each understanding that what was growing between them was something to be cherished and nurtured. On a crisp autumn day, 6 months after the showdown in the sheriff's office, Ranger took Charlotte back to the wildflower meadow where she had shared her brother's letters with him. The late season blooms painted the landscape in golds and purples, a fitting backdrop for what he had planned. They spread a blanket on the flat boulder where they had sat that first time, sharing a simple picnic of bread, cheese, and apple pie that Martha had insisted on providing when she heard of their outing. "You remember what you told me that day?" Ranger asked as they watched clouds drift across the vast Montana sky. "About your brother's last letter," Charlotte nodded, her expression soft with memory. "He wanted me to live boldly, to find joy where I could. And have you," Ranger asked, taking her hand, "found joy?" Her smile was answer enough, but she replied anyway. "More than I ever thought possible again." Ranger reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small wooden box, similar to the one that held Robert's letters but small enough to fit in his palm. "I had this made by Samuel the woodworker," he explained, placing it in her hands. "Open it." Charlotte lifted the lid carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, was a simple gold ring with a small pearl. "It was my mother's," Ranger said quietly. I've carried it with me all these years, not sure why. Now I know I was waiting to give it to you. Charlotte looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Ranger. He took her hands in his, the small box between them. Charlotte Hayes, I've wandered a long time looking for something I couldn't name. In you I've found it home, purpose, love. Will you marry me? Yes, she answered without hesitation, her voice steady and sure. Yes, I will marry you, Ranger Quinn. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Ranger felt the final pieces of his broken heart knitting together. The losses of the past would always be part of him, as Robert would always be part of Charlotte, but they had found in each other the courage to begin anew. The wedding took place on a clear spring day, with the entire town turning out to celebrate. Martha, of course, insisted on hosting the reception at her boarding house, transforming the dining room into a bower of wildflowers and ribbons. Deputy-turned-Sheriff Johnson served as Ranger's best man, while one of Charlotte's fellow teachers stood up for her. But the most poignant moment came just before the ceremony, when Charlotte took Ranger's hand and led him to a quiet corner of the church. I have something for you, she said, her eyes luminous with happiness. From a small reticule, she withdrew a letter. Robert would have wanted to be here today. In a way, he is. Ranger unfolded the paper carefully, recognizing the handwriting from the letters he'd read months before. My dearest Charlotte, it began. Today I watched a wedding here at camp, one of our captains marrying a nurse who's been tending our wounded. It was a simple affair, conducted by our chaplain with rifle barrels serving as an arch for the couple to walk beneath. Yet in the midst of all this death and destruction, the joy on their faces was transcendent. Ranger continued reading, his voice growing husky with emotion. It made me think of your future wedding day, sister mine. I hope I'm there to see it, to walk you down the aisle and place your hand in that of a man worthy of you. A man of honor and courage, who sees your strength as well as your gentleness. A man who will build a life with you based on mutual respect and abiding love. Charlotte reached up to wipe a tear from Ranger's cheek. Keep reading, she encouraged softly. But if fate decrees I cannot be there in person, know that I am with you in spirit. And know this, too, love is the greatest act of courage in this uncertain world. To open your heart fully, knowing the risks, is the boldest thing a person can do. I hope you find someone who makes that risk worthwhile. Ranger's voice broke on the final words. Someone who brings you such joy that you forget to be afraid. He would have loved you, Charlotte whispered, her own eyes swimming with tears. Almost as much as I do. Ranger folded the letter carefully and returned it to her. I'll spend my life trying to be the man he described, he promised. The man you deserve. You already are, she assured him, rising on tiptoes to kiss him softly. Now come, husband-to-be, we have a future to begin. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, the traditional vows spoken with conviction by both bride and groom. As Ranger placed a simple gold band on Charlotte's finger to join her engagement ring, he marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a chance encounter on a stormy night to a commitment that would last a lifetime. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Ranger drew Charlotte onto the small dance floor that had been cleared in Martha's dining room. As they swayed together to the music of a local fiddler, he held her close, savoring the feeling of her in his arms. Happy, Mrs. Quinn. He murmured against her hair. Charlotte looked up at him, her smile radiant. Perfectly, and you, husband? More than I ever thought possible, he answered honestly. You've given me back something I thought was lost forever, Charlie. Hope, a future. We've given that to each other, she corrected gently, and we'll keep building on it day by day. As the evening drew to a close, they slipped away from the festivities to begin their new life together. Ranger had purchased a small house on the edge of town, nothing grand, but solid and well-built, with room to grow. It would be their first real home, a place to put down the roots they both had craved for so long. That night, as moonlight spilled through the window of their bedroom, Ranger held Charlotte close, overwhelmed by the knowledge that after years of solitary wandering he had found where he belonged. In this town, in this woman's arms, he had discovered not just purpose, but joy, the kind of joy that Robert had urged his sister to seek, that Sarah would have wanted him to find again. "What are you thinking?" Charlotte asked softly, her head pillowed on his chest. "That some journeys end exactly where they're supposed to," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And that some stories, even after heartbreak, can have a beautiful second chapter." Charlotte propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him with eyes full of love. "Second chapter. Ranger Quinn, I think we're just getting started." And as he drew her down for a kiss, Ranger knew she was right. Their story wasn't ending, it was only beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, writing each new page with courage, commitment, and abiding love. Years passed, and Whisperwood grew from a frontier settlement into a proper town. The railroad came through in 1880, bringing new prosperity and opportunities. Ranger continued serving as deputy sheriff, his steady presence and fair-minded approach earning him the community's respect and trust. Charlotte expanded her role beyond the schoolhouse, establishing Whisperwood's first public library in a small building donated by a grateful parent whose child she had taught. The collection began with her own books and grew through donations and carefully budgeted purchases. On Saturday afternoons, she held reading circles for children and adults alike, fostering a love of literature throughout the community. Their family grew as well. In the spring of 1878, they welcomed their first child, a son they named Robert James, honoring both Charlotte's brother and Ranger's lost son. 2 years later, a daughter followed, Sarah Elizabeth, with her mother's whiskey-colored eyes and her father's determined spirit. Through it all, they maintained the tradition of reading aloud to each other in the evenings after the children were asleep. Sometimes they shared poetry or passages from novels, but most precious were the nights when Charlotte would take out the wooden box of her brother's letters, selecting one to read by lamplight. As the children grew old enough to understand, they included them in this ritual, ensuring that the uncle and half-brother they would never meet remained alive in family memory. And beside Robert's letters in the wooden box, they added new documents, the children's first written words, letters Ranger sent when duties occasionally took him away from home, sketches Charlotte made of their growing family. On a warm evening in the summer of 1886, 10 years after that first meeting, Ranger returned home to find Charlotte sitting on their porch swing, a letter in her hands and tears on her cheeks. Alarmed, he hurried to her side. "Charlie, what's wrong?" She shook her head, smiling through her tears. "Nothing's wrong. Something wonderful has happened." She handed him the letter. "It's from the Territorial Education Board. They've accepted my proposal for a teacher training program here in Whisperwood. They're providing funding for a proper academy." Ranger's face broke into a proud smile. "Charlie, that's incredible. You've been working toward this for years." Charlotte nodded, her expression a mixture of disbelief and elation. "It means we can train teachers right here, prepare them specifically for the challenges of rural schools. No more sending east for educators who aren't ready for frontier conditions. It's going to transform education across the territory," Ranger said, drawing her into a celebratory embrace. "I'm so proud of you." From inside the house came the sound of childish voices raised in argument, followed by a crash and guilty silence. Charlotte laughed, resting her forehead against Ranger's chest. Duty calls, Deputy Quinn. So it does, Mrs. Quinn. Together, they went inside to referee whatever dispute had erupted between their offspring. Later, after the children were finally asleep, they returned to the porch swing, enjoying the cooling evening air and the canopy of stars above. "I was thinking about that night," Charlotte said quietly, her head resting on Ranger's shoulder. "The first time you found me reading Robert's letters." "The night that changed everything," Ranger agreed, his arm tightening around her. Charlotte nodded against his shoulder. "I was so closed off then, so determined to live in the past because it felt safer than risking the future. And now," she looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight, "now I understand what Robert meant in that last letter about living boldly, about finding joy." Her hand found Ranger's, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. "I found it in you, in our children, in the life we've built together." Ranger brought her hand to his lips. "As did I, Charlie, as did I." As they sat together on the porch of the home they'd built, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, Ranger reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From two broken souls, each carrying the weight of profound loss, they had forged something beautiful and enduring: a family, a partnership, a love that had only deepened with each passing year. The letters that had once been all Charlotte had left of her brother had become just one thread in the rich tapestry of their shared life. They remained precious, these links to the past, but they no longer defined her or them. Instead, they were writing their own story, day by day, year by year. A story of second chances and new beginnings, of courage found in unlikely places and hope rekindled from the ashes of despair. A story that had begun on a stormy night in 1876, when a weary lawman had glimpsed a light in a cabin window and followed his instincts to the doorway where his future waited.